Welcome to the Urban Complex, a system of interrelated emotion-charged ideas, feelings, memories, and impulses. This name takes us and lays out what a listener should expect, a podcast where ideas, feelings, and memories collide, leading towards meaningful change. All opinions by Chris Richardson, Dominic Papa, and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Arizona State University or the Arizona Commerce Authority. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for decisions. Any endorsement or messages from sponsors are solely supporting the production of this podcast. There are no relationships further than the podcast purposes with any sponsor unless separately created with another entity. Enjoy the Urban Complex. Smarter cities for a stronger tomorrow.
All right, Chris, here we are. First week of February. So we officially got the first month of 2021 behind us. So what do you think? Is it things back to normal?
Let's hope. I mean, everyone knows we're you've seen us in different places. We're from Arizona. Dom lives in Phoenix. I live in Scottsdale. We've had crazy torrential downpour rain. We don't see that too often.
There was snow, wasn't there? Wasn't there snow?
I know. We had people leaving meetings and going out and checking out snow, and they're filming expletives, and I'm like, all right, well, yeah. I have to forget. I mean, I've been a long time snow skier, and I go up to Flagstaff every once in a while. But yeah. Seeing it down here is very, very rare.
I know it makes me question how great 2021 is going to be if there's snow in Arizona or Phoenix, Arizona, and Scottsdale.
Exactly. Not in the hills around us, which is pretty common. We usually see that once a year, once every other year, literally in the lowlands. So
that was wild. Yeah. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to really get back to normal. I mean, but how normal is this? We're still in our houses doing this instead of out on the road meeting some of these guests in person. But I'm just ready. I'm ready for us to dive in and get going, even if we have to do it from our houses, though.
Me too.
Yep. So who we got today?
All right. Well, today is Mark Schwartz. He's an interesting guy in that, ironically, I got embedded with him via Twitter. Very bizarre story. So I went to an Amazon Web Services reInvent conference, I think 3 years ago now. And as part of their gift to executives, they passed out his book, A Seat at the Table. And I was like, man, this is amazing. And I decided to have the book and buy it for all of my leadership team. We've been doing this twice a year, a book club, and we read A Seat at the Table together, and it was so exhilarating to show some of the small wins we had done with what a big umbrella could be around agile leadership, around cross-functional partnership. And so after reading the book, I said, I need to connect with this guy on Twitter just to follow what's going on. And within a week of me following him, he made this announcement. I'm looking for people that have experience in settings with agile leadership that can help me contribute to a book I'm writing. I said, hey, I'd be happy to. And so next thing I know, he's given me a pre-read of his book, War and Peace in IT. And so I get to read it, and he puts a quote of mine in the book.
Oh, awesome.
And then as I was sharing that with the team, Lev Gonik, the CIO of ASU, said, hey, we're having a retreat. Let's get Mark to come talk to our leadership and inspire how you did with your development team. So we had him. He came out to a retreat we had in Flagstaff. I think there was 8 of us. He joined us for dinner. Then he came back to ASU. Flagstaff's about 2 hours away. He'd flown in from like South Africa or something, joined us in Flagstaff, then drove back down to Phoenix, and then engaged those that wanted to attend across the University Technology office. I think we had about 80 people that joined, and it was just really great. And since then, he had me do the same thing. I get to pre-read The Delicate Art of Bureaucracy, so there's a quote in there too. So it's been really fun building a relationship that started with just his book. The principles are so deep. We read it. We asked him a bunch of questions, and then he said, "I'd be happy to come out." And that's what Amazon Web Services is all about. They're focused on the customer. They want us to succeed. They have thought leadership like this that can spark the conversation. So that's my story about knowing Mark.
That's awesome. I mean, I think that's a perfect story about how relationships build and how people get to meet each other. It's a perfect example of why we have this this podcast. Should we get him on? Are we ready?
Let's do it. Let's have him.
Go.
Mark, please let Dom and I give you a warm welcome to our podcast, Urban Complex.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Cool. Well, we have found that the best way to start is just telling our audience about yourself. So maybe you can kind of bring a little bit about your career and how you found yourself here today with Amazon Web Services. We'll get to your role there and the books you've written later, but let's just start with who you are and how you got here.
Okay. Well, let's see. Maybe I'll start with what I was doing right before Amazon Web Services, because I think the two things go together very nicely. So I was a government CIO. I was the CIO of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services in the Department of Homeland Security in the U.S. government. That was my only time in the government, and it was a fascinating experience. Before that, I was CIO of a company in San Francisco. I was CEO of a small software company, and various other things. You probably don't want to hear the whole history. I'll start right around there. The government experience was fascinating because anything that's a challenge for a company in the private sector, I think, is a big challenge in the government. It's just everything is exaggerated in a way, or all challenges are. So what I've learned, especially now that I'm at AWS and working with a lot of different companies, is that private sector versus public sector is maybe not a relevant distinction or a really important one. What's really important, I think, is the distinction between a large traditional enterprise versus a new startup sort of enterprise. Whether it's public sector or private sector, large traditional enterprises have found a way of doing things that's worked for them in the past. And as they try to transform and become digital, they have to figure out how to change that, undo some of what's made them successful before, as opposed to, a brand new startup that's just creating itself for the first time. There's a very different set of challenges involved in those situations. And I'm fascinated by those challenges and how you solve them.
Great. Well, we don't like drama here. And so just making sure everyone knows that you were not with that Department of Homeland Security during this last presidential time, correct?
That would be correct. Yes, I was. I joined the government during the Obama administration, and I left a little bit into the Trump administration.
I only say that is just, boy, immigration was just at the heart of a lot, and I'm sure your past experiences, you've just thought a lot about what your role is, which leads you nicely into Amazon Web Services. Tell us about kind of what you do there now, and obviously that wasn't meant to be political. Just talk about crazy change there, and I think if you really want to influence change, your role now is really interesting. So tell us about what you're doing there. What's an enterprise strategist?
Yeah, actually, I want to backtrack a tiny bit there around immigration. Something interesting to point out there. Yeah. Again, non-political, but the situation for us was during the Obama administration, immigration was, one of those top agenda items, and we were expecting really a lot of change around immigration. Not as much happened as we expected, but things like DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals, and increasing the number of refugees allowed into the country, and a few other things did happen, and we expected a lot more, and that really determined a lot of our strategy. We said to ourselves, if this is an area where things are going to be changing a lot, then we're going to have to learn to be a lot more nimble and a lot more agile, and to shorten our response times for change and things like that. So that led to a lot of the things that I did while I was at USCIS. But anyway, it was time to make a change, just because it was time to make a change. It wasn't a political thing. I realized that I had been relying heavily on the cloud at USCIS, and I had found it transformative. It was a very big enabling change. I realized that it was an important enabler for government in general, which I had a very, clear line of sight into, let's say, and probably for the world. And so when I started talking to AWS about the possibility of me joining them, it seemed like a really easy, obvious fit. You know, I believe the cloud is where all the exciting stuff is happening right now. I mean, cloud is too small a word for it, I think. You know, when people think about the cloud, they often think in terms of the infrastructure, you know, putting servers in the cloud or storage. But really the cloud today includes AWS offers more than 175 different services, and they're interesting things like machine learning and IoT services and analytics and you know, all these other interesting high-level services. And it feels like the exciting frontier where new ideas are being developed, it's all in the cloud these days. So that's how I wound up at AWS. What I do at AWS, did you ask me that? I should
I
answer
did, but you know, before I know we're going to get deeper into what you just said when we get into some of your books, and you're just such consistent with the cloud. This isn't necessary. I mean, this is definitely not a commercial for the cloud. It's definitely not a commercial for your organization. But like one of our recent guests, like Rick Smith from the CEO of Axon, I mean, he just told amazing stories about how the cloud as a platform just allowed him and his company to completely change their relationship with customers. And I think that's what you did with immigration, and I think why you're in your role. And it's just, I think it's so important to reinforce that to give context to what you're about to say now. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to do the commercial for the cloud, as you said. It's kind of implicit in everything I say. I mean, the cloud was the big enabler for what we did at USCIS. I can tell you all about the business outcomes that we accomplished, and you know, maybe it'll be implicit that the cloud was a big part of them. But what question were you about to ask me? My role.
No, so now with the current enterprise strategist role, like, what are you personally accountable for?
Yeah.
And how did things change when COVID? I think that's important to hear people too.
Yeah, for sure. Enterprise strategist is a made-up role. You know, I don't know of any other company that has them. It's a very Amazonian thing because the way that we think is, you know, we're looking to make our customers successful. Our customers being the companies, the enterprises that use AWS. And we noticed that one of the big things that was getting in their way was the non-technical aspects of moving to the cloud and transforming. So things like cultural change and organizational structure and governance models and investment strategies and getting their people the right skills and those kinds of things. Typically, they were the real impediments to transformation for most of our customers, most of our large customers. So we invented this enterprise strategist role. We're a team of about 15 of us now, all of whom were senior IT leaders in previous roles before they joined AWS. So generally CIOs, CTOs, CISOs. Some of us had other roles like CEO and COO. And what we do at AWS is, number one, we work with large enterprise customers to help them get through some of those big impediments, the non-technical impediments to transformation. We each meet with 130 or so customers a year, generally at senior executive levels. We also speak at conferences and other kinds of events. We write books and articles and blog posts and record podcasts and things like that, trying to put some thought leadership and some guidance out there for large organizations that are trying to change the way they do things. That's what the role is. And as you can tell, it's a pretty flexible role. The guideline is, can we help our customers be more successful? We're not salespeople. We're out there to help customers.
And for anything specific around COVID that has changed that role for you? Just curious.
Well, the role itself hasn't changed. I mean, we're still trying to do the same things. But before, I was traveling about 90% of the time. You know, I like in-person meetings. I find them much more effective. So I was visiting customers around the world and traveling to conferences and other speaking engagements around the world. And my colleagues were doing the same. And now we're at zero travel. So that's changed things. We do everything virtually. it has some implications. I mean, you don't get the face-to-face contact, but I find that since most people are working from home, when I'm on a video conference with people, I'm seeing their faces. You know, we're all at home, so each of us is one face on the camera at a time, as opposed to, you know, if they were all in their office in a conference room and I was the only one remote and I was looking at a picture of tiny little people around a conference room table, you know, that maybe would be a problem for what I do. But it's working remotely is working pretty well, I find. And since it takes away the travel, it lets me do more of what I would otherwise be doing. But actually, one interesting challenge is that since I meet with customers all over the world, normally I'd be flying to them and I'd be in their time zones, whereas now I'm in very different time zones. So when I meet with a customer in Australia or Singapore or Malaysia, which all of which I've done recently, that means I'm up late at night doing it and trying to figure out how to stay awake and keep my energy up.
Yeah, that's great. I feel you there, Mark. We just had a conference where we zoomed in people from Dubai and Mumbai, and I felt bad for them being up at 2 a.m. to participate in our conference.
I do too, especially now that I've been in that position. Yes.
Right. That's great. Well, Mark, thanks for that background. It's fascinating. And I found something that you said very interesting, you know, cloud as being this enabler for government. You know, as you know, this is a podcast around smart cities. And one of the biggest knocks that the smart city movement gets all the time is there's no definition. No one knows what exactly a smart city is or what it means. And so, you know, part of the goal of this podcast is to bring some clarity around what a smart city is through the views, of our guests. And so it's been a lot of fun hearing the different views of our guests of what they think smart cities are, you know, mayors, CIOs of governments, even private sector individuals like the CEO of Axon. So, you know, we would love to get kind of your view of what you think a smart city is or how a smart city interacts with its community and kind of, you know, describe how AWS kind of enables the smart city movement or works with the smart city movement.
Yeah, so obviously you're asking me because you want to make sure you get the opinion of somebody who knows nothing whatsoever about the subject. I'm exaggerating, but you know, I can't claim to be an expert on smart cities per se. You might be right that there is no definition, and you know, that wouldn't surprise me. But I think it's also one of those you know it when you see it kind of things. You know, there's like a cluster of things that seem to be smart city like. So I'll tell you a little bit about the journey that I'm on. I didn't know that much about local government and state governments, city governments. I was in the federal government for that last role. And as I started learning more and more about local government, it's fascinating. You know, I wonder why I didn't go into local government in the first place, you know, because it so directly touches people, where federal government, you know, for the most part, it's more of an indirect kind of a thing. In federal government, you specialize in one particular area. For me, it was immigration. But local governments, let's say the CIO of a city government, is going to be touching so many different areas that affect people directly. And I'm also thinking that in a way that local government is more and more important to us these days, because look at vaccine distribution. You know, that's going to happen at the local level. Unemployment, insurance, what else? Homelessness as a big local problem. All of these things are areas that we're going to need to address. And they happen primarily at the local levels. So I find it fascinating. In terms of smart cities, my view from where I am in the AWS organization is we have customers that are local governments and nonprofits that help with local issues. And we are always working backwards from our customers. We're always trying to, we say that we try to be customer obsessed. We try to understand our customers' concerns and challenges and innovate to find solutions for them. That's what we do. And so many of our customers are city governments or those nonprofits that are working on objectives within cities. And whatever their challenges are, we want to work backwards from those challenges and help them find solutions. And so whether you call something smart city or not, for my part of AWS, I'm talking about, is less relevant than let's interact, and so I can understand what your challenges are and I can try to help find solutions. So we do have things like our Cloud Innovation Center at ASU, which is focused on smart cities related initiatives. But again, the way it works is through these challenges. We solicit challenges from the community and then work backwards on those challenges to see what we can solve, rather than trying to invent some fancy sounding technology and say, oh, that's a smart city, use it, kind of thing. But I don't mean to say anything negative about the concept of smart cities. I do think there's this cluster of interesting things that we can do now technologically that we couldn't do before that can have a huge impact on cities. And, the things that jump to my mind have to do with IoT, Internet of Things, with sensors, and how you can use them to dynamically regulate or control what's going on or respond to things that are going on in a city, ways to use data, and in many cases to trigger automated responses based on data. I think, and I'm sure you're much more of an expert than I am, but it seems like there's this whole interesting space where technology meets living in a city. And to me, that's probably where smart cities lurk.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's brilliant. And I think that's why I latched on to that comment about cloud being an enabler for government, because that's kind of how I have seen it. Smart cities, while there may not be no definition, I see smart cities as an enabler, right, to solve those challenges, because you're right. You're exactly right. It touches the people, right? And it addresses those challenges that need to be addressed. And so I think that's why I gravitated to that comment, because I believe that smart cities really can be an enabler. It doesn't have to be specific. It's just it's a broad enabler.
Right. And being in an area where we're an enabler, we're constantly discovering that our customers are doing these fascinating things that we didn't necessarily think of beforehand. So to give you a couple of examples that I really love, the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. What they do is obvious from the name, I think. They realized that they could use our image recognition technology to scour social media, scour the internet for photos of children that were missing. And when they found a hit, they could pass a lead on to law enforcement to try to locate the children. That's just so powerful and amazing. And once you put a tool like image recognition out there, our amazing customers start to discover all these wonderful ways to use them that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. Or another example, I always talk about agility in the cloud, but there are some kinds of agility that I hadn't really thought of before. But a great example is the American Red Cross in Texas when the flooding was happening there. What was that, Hurricane Harvey or one of those? And so there's all this flooding. The American Red Cross has money that they can give out to people whose property has been damaged. So what happens when you have money to give out? People start calling you. A lot of people call you, and their call center couldn't handle it. So we have a call center in the cloud, Amazon Connect, and in 48 hours, they created a new call center with all the business rules that they needed that could expand virtually infinitely. They trained new operators to answer the phones. I think we provided some volunteers from Amazon, and set up this brand new call center that could scale up with their new volume. And then when the rush was over and the calls started to subside, they just scaled down the call center and eventually closed it and went back to their original one. That's amazing, right?
Well, a smart city initiative when it's there. So they're not just lurking. They're there.
They're there, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, that is so incredible. And Mark, you just hit on exactly why Chris and I started this podcast in the first place. It's because these stories are so powerful. Those stories that you just mentioned are so powerful that, we can learn from each other. We don't have to have all the answers ourselves. And so if we can just help share stories like the ones you just shared, we can all learn, and help better our communities through these stories. That's just incredible. Thanks for sharing that. So, I mean, if we transition back to kind of this idea of city as an enabler to help solve challenges, one of the challenges it hopefully helps solve is, dealing with bureaucracy and those, the struggles of bureaucracy, especially that we find at the local level. So tell us a little bit about, the premise of your book, The Delicate Art of Bureaucracy, and how do you think our audience might relate, and what should they take away from your message of the book?
You left out the subtitle of the book. That's the best part, isn't it? It's The Delicate Art of Bureaucracy, Digital Transformation with the Monkey, the Razor, and the Sumo Wrestler.
I love that.
Which, you need to understand about the monkey, the razor, and the sumo wrestler if you're going to understand bureaucracy and what to do about it. So this is my fourth book, and all of my books have been related. They're basically about what happens now that we have these ways of being more agile in our technology. The technology world has changed a lot, not just in the technology itself, but in the processes that we use to implement technology, create capabilities for organizations to use and things like that. So given that change has happened, how does that affect the way you lead an organization? How does it affect the way that technology is part of the company that it's in? How does it relate to the rest of the business, and things like that? And so each of my books has addressed some aspect of that problem. And it turns out that sometimes when you're trying to become more agile and take advantage of technology, you run into bureaucracy. This, of course, never happens to any of our customers at AWS, who are all, very
Definitely
functional
not.
organizations.
Definitely not.
But I find that some people have a friend, that has a bureaucracy problem. And so it turns out that I know a lot about bureaucracy, having been in the federal government. And I thought maybe some of the things I learned there would be useful. And so I reflected. I had 7 years in the government, and there was a lot to think about. And I wrote this book both as an examination of what bureaucracy really is and where it becomes a problem, and also a playbook on how you might want to deal with it if it's getting in your way. And so the first interesting thing about it is people tend to have this gut reaction around bureaucracy, like, this is, oh my God, I can't take this, I have to commit suicide. There's bureaucracy around me. I don't know, we've got this hatred of bureaucracy. But when bureaucracy was a thing, when it started to be looked at intellectually, academically, and in management theory, it wasn't considered a bad thing. It was just a way to organize. Bureaucracy essentially means that you have rigid rules and you have rigid org charts, rigid roles with accountability. And every company has them. Every company is based on a bureaucratic model at some level. You have rules that have to be implemented and have to be followed. And you have a division of labor with separate accountabilities. You have a marketing department that does marketing. You have a sales department that does sales. Finance department does finance. Well, those are the structures of bureaucracy, and it's not something that we should, be afraid of or hate or anything. On the other hand, it does get in the way when you're trying to make changes, or often does. And so I looked a little more deeply into what is it about bureaucracies that we're facing every day, beyond just rigid roles and rigid rules, that is the obstacle, is really the impediment, is really the thing that gives us this visceral reaction. And in the book, I divide it into three things, really. I say there are three characteristics that bureaucracies tend to take on, but that they don't have to. And those three characteristics are the horrible things that we hate. And there's a set of 3 positive attributes that they could have correspondingly that would make us hate the bureaucracy a lot less. So the goal of transformation, in a sense, is to take each of those negative things and turn it to the corresponding positive thing. So the 3 things that drive us crazy are that, number one, bureaucracies tend to be coercive. Their goal is to force you to do things, to restrict you, and in many cases they're a way for management to control their employees. So coercive is the first thing. The second thing is that bureaucracies tend to not change. That once a rule is set, it stays forever. And sometimes you need to change, right? So that's the second thing. And the third thing is that bureaucracies are often bloated or wasteful. I know this is a big surprise, right? You fill out forms in triplicate. My working example was the process we had for releasing a new IT system in the government, where we had to write 87 documents, and we had to have 11 stage gate reviews, it was tremendously expensive and slow. So those are the 3 bad characteristics. That bureaucracies are coercive, petrified, meaning they don't learn, and bloated. And those 3 things are not a necessary part of having rigid rules and rigid roles. It doesn't follow, but bureaucracies tend to have those 3 things. On the other hand, a bureaucracy that's coercive can turn into a bureaucracy that is enabling. That would be the opposite. There are many examples of bureaucracies that are highly enabling. From IT, one example would be security, where obviously security has a lot of rules and has a lot of approvals and things like that that are typical of a bureaucracy. But the movement in DevOps and in a lot of contemporary IT practice is for security to be part of the delivery teams, as opposed to a gatekeeper that says, no, you can't do that. For security to be done through automated tests that can be used by everybody else on the team to see if their code is secure, instead of a security troll coming in at the end and stomping on everything you've done as a developer. The security, that approach to security empowers the software developers and everybody else to go and create great stuff, knowing that they're not going to do anything horrible, that they're going to stay within the bounds. So that would be an example of how you can take something that's coercive and turn it into something that's enabling. The second thing was petrification. And it turns out you can have a learning bureaucracy. That would be the opposite. There's no reason why the rules in a bureaucracy can't continuously change and continuously be improved. What is necessary in a bureaucracy is that once you have a rule, everybody has to follow it. Impartially it's applied, it's an absolute. That's true. But that doesn't mean that the rule can't change often, or as often as necessary. And there are, again, good examples where bureaucracies have become learning bureaucracies. And then my favorite, bloated bureaucracies can become lean bureaucracies. And this is just an application of lean theory in general, lean manufacturing, Lean Six Sigma, all the lean practices. A bureaucracy it manufactures compliance. That's what a bureaucracy does. It's a manufacturing process. And it has a series of steps that take you to, the output being compliance. And what you can do is, just like with any manufacturing process, you could look at the steps in that process and say, where is there waste that doesn't need to be there in order to manufacture that compliance as the output? There almost always there's junk in there that you don't really need, and you can take away and still manufacture that compliance. And yes, those 87 documents and the 11 gate reviews, we did a quick shave of that. We took it down to about 15 documents instead of 87, and 2 gate reviews instead of 11. And there was still plenty more room to go. That's the nature of lean. You can just keep shaving and shaving. So anyway, that's what the book is about, is how you take a bureaucracy with those 3 bad characteristics and turn them into those 3 good characteristics.
So now we've got where technology meets living, smart cities can lurk, but if the city itself structures so that it's enabling, there's constant learning, and they're focused on leaning, now we can have a good bureaucracy to get the outcomes you envision. Okay,
Yes,
we can work with
yes,
that.
Yeah, I
right.
love
I
it.
said one of those characteristics, one of the 3 characteristics of a good bureaucracy is that it's enabling.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're talking about. As a smart, you put it this way, and I like it, that a smart city is an enabler of all kinds of great services for citizens and, productivity for the economy and so on.
Well, so let's take a step backwards. In reverse chronological order of your books, you had one called War and Peace in IT, and my take on reading it was that it's about kind of teaching the non-IT function how to work with the IT function. And we've heard on our podcast, we've heard how we brought the city of Tempe together, where they had a dual team that ran a task force that was all about innovation. It was really fascinating to hear. What's kind of your view from War and Peace in IT about how business leaders can better work with IT leaders to get these types of to get to where the bureaucracy is enabling learning and lean?
Yeah. Well, so before War and Peace in IT, I wrote a book called Seat at the Table, IT Leadership in the Age of Technology. I can usually remember the subtitles of my books. And one of the points I made in that book was that it's important for IT organizations to be very closely integrated with the rest of the business. And that it's kind of trite saying it that way. There's a lot more to it. But a lot of the people who read that book were in the IT community, and they said, "Great, we should be integrated with the business. Somebody better tell the business that." And I thought, okay, I sort of have a responsibility now, don't I? So I wrote War and Peace in IT to try to explain to the non-IT parts of the business how they might best work with IT and get the most out of the IT organization. I called it War and Peace in IT, of course, because it's a sequel to Tolstoy's famous novel, where I found that he had to stop before he got to digital transformation because his book was already too long. So I wrote a shorter one that just picked up where he left off. And it turns out War and Peace in IT is all about, the backdrop to the whole story is Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. And it turns out that that invasion has a lot of lessons for us when we think about digital transformation. So that's really where the book came from, where the title came from. But in both cases, I'm trying to make the case for a new way of collaborating across the different parts of the organization, and specifically the quote IT part and the quote business part, which is a silly distinction to me, even though we use those terms all the time, because IT is the business, is a big part of it, and more as we become more digital. And when you look at the history of IT coming into companies, you see that part of the reason for this is it was a shock, to companies in, say, the 1960s, 1970s, whenever all of a sudden they had to do this technology stuff. Instead of having these the kinds of people they had in a business before, now you've got these sort of geeky geniuses, who are sort of techie and speak a funny language. And as a business manager, you'd have to think, well, how can I control these people? I don't understand a word they're saying. And the relationship between IT and the rest of the business grew up around that problem. How do you have control over something that is new and you don't really understand it? And I think that control aspect has led us to a lot of problems, makes it hard for companies to become digital, or cities, or whoever else. Where now in the IT world, we're discovering that cross-functional teams are very successful. We're discovering that in management in general, but in technology, we're seeing just how valuable it is. So I asked the question, what if the cross-functional team wasn't just a bunch of IT functions, but it was also the business functions, and they were on the same team rather than the business people making up requirements and tossing them over the wall to the technologists? What if you literally had a team trying to solve a problem that included both things? And the model then can be very different for how you run an IT initiative. And we actually did this at USCIS. We invented a new way, essentially, of governing and overseeing an IT initiative that was based on this idea. But this, I think, applies generally, not just to IT and the business. It applies in any bureaucracy where you have a lot of silos, and siloed behavior says one silo has to hand a piece of work over to another silo, and they have to hand it over to another silo. And each time you have this sort of, handoff kind of thing going on. And that prevents creativity. It restricts the solutions you can come up with. It adds time, it adds cost. And it's not necessary. You can make cross-functional teams and have silos working more closely together. And I think from what you said, it makes me think of what I saw in Phoenix when we were working on homelessness as a project of the Cloud Innovation Center, where Phoenix has this wonderful thing going, right? Where it's like a shared services campus with something like 19 different organizations that provide services to people experiencing homelessness. And they work together on a campus instead of, a person experiencing homelessness going to one place to get shelter for the night and then having to figure out how they could get all the way to the other side of town to talk to an employment counselor or something when they don't have bus fare necessarily, or, whatever other obstacles they have. It's this co-location and collaboration and removal of these walls between silos that makes for this really powerful way to serve the public. So I think that would be an example from outside of IT of how this can work.
Great, thanks. And you touched upon the seat at the table briefly. I haven't read The Art of Business Value, but I have read the other three. And I know. But the seat at the table is really interesting. You actually, full disclosure, you actually came and spoke to our University Technology Office leadership, and it really helped solidify some of the agile principles for us to take action. But one thing I think is a theme is some of our city IT leadership, many of them came up from operational roles, and so they have that operational mindset. And I think what Seat at the Table did really well is not only help spell agile and why to move and kind of open that door to working in tandem with those cross-functional roles that included business folks, which is critical that you just outlined. But I think there's also a mindset in taking some risk and doing it differently. How can you help tell our audience about becoming a more transformational leader with the principles of the book, Seat at the Table?
Mm-hmm. The way I think about transformational leadership is somebody has to have a vision of what the goal is, where the transformation is going to go. It might not be a detailed vision, but it's a vision of what you're trying to accomplish by transforming. And at the same time, to lead a transformation, you have to actually do things. And so, often what happens is there'll be a big vision, and the big vision gets bigger and bigger, and a lot of plans are made, and then, the plans have to be extended, and you produce piles and piles of planning documents and stuff, but nothing ever happens. That doesn't work.
You ever lived in local government?
Yeah, I know.
Or you get thou shalt follow this with no plan
yes.
to act.
Or Fortune 500 companies go through the same thing, except the ones who are customers of ours, who of course would never do anything dysfunctional like that. But it is kind of a typical pattern to try to do a big thing all the way. and get into this sort of paralysis where once you're trying to be perfect, then there are all sorts of new things that people want to do in order to contribute to this perfect thing. And so what I found works well is if you've got that vision, that's a really strong vision, and you just keep fighting for that vision, but you get there by doing a lot of small incremental things. And so in my organization at USCIS, everybody knew I was looking for speed and responsiveness. And if they didn't know it, they learned it within 5 minutes of joining the organization, because I just kept saying it over and over again, essentially, right? At one point, we found that some of our procurements were taking 3 years, and I said, I want to find a way that can be done in 30 days. And when my team came back to me and said, we just did one in 30 days, they knew what I was going to say next, which is, why does it have to be 30 days? Why can't we make it shorter? Because my vision, it was clear. Everybody knew what I was going for, and that helped a lot. But when it came to implementation, my question for my team was always, what can we do by next week that will move us towards that goal? What's the small thing? And then we'll do another small thing and another small thing. And we'll keep moving. And that combination I find to be the effective one. And I see that with the customers that I talk to also. So how does it apply to government initiatives? I think you have to, it takes a little bit of rethinking and restructuring how you do things in order to make it comfortable to work in that way, where you're trying to accomplish one thing after another. But one thing I do want to say, you mentioned, I think you said something about taking risks, and this is where I think we make a mistake, a little mental mistake around risk taking. Sometimes we say things like, you got to fail fast. You have to be willing to do things that you're not comfortable with. You need to be willing to try experiments and fail fast. That's a way of talking, but it's not a very accurate one. The point is that you don't take risks, and that's why you take this approach. So old school way of doing things, you might plan a very big initiative, and then you would just go do it. And that feels like it's not risky, but if you think about it, you're risking the entire initiative. It might not work. It might not have the impact that you want it to have. It might not be feasible. There are all sorts of risks around doing something with, deliberateness. Whereas experimenting is a way of eliminating risk by trying out the things you think you're going to do, but making sure they work before you fully commit to them. That's really what we're talking about.
Right, but the risk there is creating the environment where people are willing to try that different model when they're not used to it, and that is its own kind of a risk taking, because you're changing the status quo to move from the current bureaucracy to the world by which you see. And I think that's the risk that I'm hearing is what you're calling out.
Yeah, well, I think it's easy to confuse fear with risk. And that's the first thing I would say. So whenever you move to a new way of doing things, it feels risky, but that's not really risk, that's fear. The fact that something is new, well, it might be a new thing that's designed to reduce your risk, or a new thing that's going to increase your risk. Could be either one. Just the fact that it's new doesn't make it risky. And that's, I think, what we're talking about here, these new ways of doing technology where you get fast feedback. These are things designed to reduce risk. And so it feels risky because it's new, but that's really just fear of the new, I would say. But another thing that helps with that, because you did point to something that I think is a real risk there, is you don't just blindly do a lot of experiments, right? The point is you are trying out ways of accomplishing an objective, and you have to be clear on the objective, and the things you're trying out have to be designed to accomplish that objective. And then you're just making sure that they actually do before you commit more spending to them. So that's risk reduction. It's hard for a government to do that, right? Because if you go and do something that if you start down a road and realize it's not a good road, you have two choices. You can continue doing it and fail spectacularly later, but nobody will know that you made a mistake at the beginning. Or you can admit that the road you're going down isn't going to work, and you better do something different. And in a government where so many people are looking over your shoulder, and there's so much blame being thrown around, it's very hard to say, we went down this path and we discovered that it doesn't work, so we're going to switch. Well, why'd you do that? There's always, I don't know, in our case, GAO and the Inspector General and the press and everybody else saying you shouldn't have done that. And I think that's what makes it hard in government.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we could have you on talking about the books forever. They're so fascinating. I know I've learned a lot by unfortunately only reading 3 of the 4. I feel bad here. I got some work to do.
You missed some laughs.
We'll have to have you back. I'm sure you'll have books in the future. We may have guests that start to look into it, want to hear more. But we do have kind of 2 questions that we ask that are kind of slightly different. One is around appreciation and acknowledging people that have helped you personally along your journey and what you've shared. Is there anyone that you want to call out that you think really made either the books come alive or your philosophies come to realization that you'd like to talk about?
This might sound like a little bit of a cop-out. I really learned a lot by working in the government and by working with people who are experienced in the government. And when I first went in, I wasn't sure what that was going to be like. A lot of people have this impression that government employees, they're slow and whatever. And in many cases, you get that impression because of the constraints that they work under. So I didn't know what people were going to be like. And I found that it was, among my favorite people to work with in my career, some of the other government employees, really expert at accomplishing as much as they could within the constraints that they were given, really creative and really good mission-driven people. And it was a strong lesson for me, to learn that the cliches around government employees were far off from what I actually saw. Yeah, that's what I would say. I just learned so much by working with some of the great people there.
Well, we heard it when you were talking about the experience, and clearly AWS recognized that, and they needed your knowledge of how you got movement there to bring that forward. Hopefully, as you were speaking here, you were very kind of seeming longingly thinking about how you might be applied at a city. So if some city picks you up someday, hopefully Teresa or Kim Majerus, Teresa Carlson, Kim Majerus, or Faisal Hanafi, who I know don't come get mad at us for bringing you on the podcast. If some major city picks you up and transforms and takes that lurking smart city vision you have into the forefront. But that's great.
I know that those people I work with at AWS want cities to succeed, so whatever it takes, they would do whatever it takes.
And then in closing, as you've learned a little bit about us and the podcast, the Urban Complex, is there anyone you think we should be trying to get on here that would represent this movement, the greatest stories, things people can learn from, such as yourself, that we should strive to join us?
Somebody who can give a precise and unambiguous definition of smart city, right?
It doesn't exist.
I can't think of specific people, but I think the general category relates back to something that you said before, which is stories are really important. And so those who have good stories of solving problems in cities, that because it just gives a boost to everyone else to see what's possible, and then sparks their creativity, I find. So International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, look at what they were able to do with image recognition and think about how you might pull off something like that, right? It's those stories of successes or even failures, here's how we might do it better next time kinds of stories that are so important.
Well, if there's a person there you want to make an intro to, we'd be happy to.
I'll think about it. Maybe I'll come up with somebody for you.
Sounds good. Okay, well, with that, the Urban Complex gives a big note of thanks to today's guest, Mark Schwartz, enterprise strategist at Amazon Web Services and multi-time author of books like The Delicate Art of Bureaucracy and A Seat at the Table. Sorry, I didn't use the subtitles. Thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you for having me on the show.
Thanks, Mark.
Whew. All right, well, that was Mark. Dom, you hadn't heard him before. What do you think?
Absolutely brilliant. I mean, there's no really other words that I can use to describe. I thought the content of this podcast is really going to provide so many valuable points of advice for anyone working in local government, or probably just government in general, including also the nonprofits, as you mentioned, working alongside government, especially how to become transformational leaders when facing kind of the structures and the bureaucracy that you work in day to day. I mean, I just want to come back to about this idea of, the smart city as enabler, right? He first started with cloud as being the enabler for government, and we kind of brought it back to how smart city as a concept can really be this enabler for governments to address challenges that touch people and that really need to be solved. So I thought that was just incredible, especially how he laid it out so simply in my mind, how you can take an organization and transform it from coercive to enabling, from petrified to learning, and from bloated to lean. I mean, I really thought there was such great nuggets of advice in this that a lot of people are going to learn from. And then probably the last thing I really want to hit on is this idea of thinking big and acting small. I think we saw kind of a carryover of this model from Michael Sherwood and what he mentioned last week around his pilot programs and how he was leveraging the pilot programs to really take small steps to de-risk, these big visions and really get the ball moving. And that's how he's been able to get the city of Las Vegas to really, achieve some measurable outcomes by thinking big, having big visions, but acting small, right? And I think we heard the same kind of methodology from Mark. Try to do big things, have those big visions, but get there by small incremental steps. Absolutely brilliant. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I thought we were one of the more unique smart cities definitions. Just to start, the tagline "Where technology meets living." Yeah. I thought that was great. I did find it funny where he's saying that it's probably where smart cities lurks. But I do, knowing his books well. I mean, the Delicate Art of Bureaucracy does lurk, but I think it's important to stress that that's not necessarily a bad thing. But where it probably is perceived as bad is when it is in those modes when you need time of change, but you have the parts of the bureaucracy that don't allow for change. He said that bureaucracy manufactures compliance. Sometimes that's great. Sometimes you need repeatability. Sometimes you need stability. Yeah. But there's so much possible right now because technology meeting the standard of living hasn't really come to life. The consumer economy is making that happen, but people have these grand expectations. Apple and Google and Facebook, they've changed what is possible, and the citizen expects more. And so what's happened is cities have gotten to where they're at today, but they're there and they're manufacturing compliance. They're just doing it over and over and over. You've heard us talk about this, they're serving via transactions, but they haven't really flipped the experience from the citizen's view. And so if it's time to get to where that change is there, we need some strong leadership, and hopefully you're seeing our guests bring that forward. But like to get from the bureaucracy where it's the restrictive to the enabling that allows you to move forward, that it's not the change, but it can actually be a learning environment where you're constantly testing, constantly trying, constantly experimenting. And then where it's not wasteful, but it's lean and you can do more with your resources and get more done. I don't know, that to me is what's here. You combine with the other books, the War and Peace and IT concept, where it's bring your leadership together. Don't focus on it's this silo, then pass it to this silo or this silo. No, bring the folks together, have the diverse backgrounds, have the diverse inputs, but know where you're going, but just get going and try things, and don't have we've talked about planning. It's important to have the plan that gives you backup, but the plan is not an excuse to not get started. You don't need to build the perfect plan that's 10 years out. You know exactly what's going to happen. because it's defunct the minute you publish it. So I don't know. Those were, to me, things that I thought he drove home in such an elegant way. You can tell he's really spent a lot of time. He's got great experience there. And I know personally from his books, at least 3 I read, that it's legit. So
yeah, I mean, maybe last point before we want to get to the cracks of the pavement section. I just want to talk about this. I mean, he was able to get procurement from 3 years to 30 days, right? I mean, that's absolutely incredible. And I think it matches something that he also said, oftentimes people think change is risky. It's not really risk, it's that fear of change that's driving that, right? And so I think, there's a lot of things local government can learn here when they're looking at procurement, in that they think it's risky to change it, but it might just be fear, right? And so something I think very important to take away from those comments. So cracks in the pavement. What do you got for us this week, Chris?
Great, sure. One thing before I dig in, though, I want to make sure we've had a couple questions come to us about our guests. Don't forget, ask us questions that we can air here. Just hit me up at Chris, CHRIS, at theurbancomplex.com or Dom at theurbancomplex.com. We'll be happy to think about what is on your mind. One that I've been thinking about, it kind of is in line because it's kind of tied to Amazon. So Mark was our guest. It also, you heard Jen Daniels, our first guest, talk about her nerdiness, passion for transportation and mobility. And, and you also heard themes before where it takes this collaborative approach. But there's an initiative that's a $4 billion investment coming to the DC metro area that's all around transit projects. And I guess I just can't get it out of my head, because you think about how tough in the age of COVID, where you can't be so close, what it must be like to run a public transportation utility, or a bus or a rail or airlines. It's just got to be challenging, and this is in line with having a big, bold vision. But it's going to be interesting. I mean, some of these biggest projects, they have this massive ambition. I mean, this thing covers, I think, 4 or 5 different cities as well. So it's just really cool what they've signed up to do. What do you think, Tom?
Awesome. So wait, so 4 or 5 different cities. So it sounds kind of like a regional play there.
That's my take on it. Yeah, I mean, it covers, it's called the National Landing, but it covers like Crystal City and Alexandria and oh my gosh, let me look through here. I don't know. I'm not.
Probably Pentagon City, maybe.
Yeah, Pentagon City, exactly. Yeah, I think there's 5 in total.
Well, lived in DC for a short little bit, but yeah, I mean, that's, I love this idea. And again, I think it goes back to, especially my passion for not creating smart cities in silos, but how about create smart regions and really think about impact at scale, right? While regional approaches might be big visions, you can take small steps to get there. And so I'm going to be watching this with a very, very close eye, especially because mobility is one of my big passions here in Arizona, and kind of our thinking around what we're going to do to really accelerate the future of mobility here. So sounds like a great project. I mean, let's hope that they're able to act small and not just have that big vision and go after that big project and not quite get there. It'll be interesting to watch them kind of reiterate on that.
Yeah, if anyone watching or listening knows someone that was a key strategic architect in the project, we'd love to get them on the podcast, talk about how they made something like this happen, what the expected results are, what maybe some of the small wins that led to this big initiative were there behind. We'd love to hear.
Especially around mobilizing the ecosystems necessary for a project like that. I mean, would love to hear that. So yeah, please reach out to us.
Great. Well, with that, you've another wrap of the Urban Complex. Mark was amazing. You can hear us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Keep up the social love. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And then again, just you can sign up for our newsletter and be prepared for hearing from us in the future. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Definitely. Thanks a lot. See you next week.